The goal of my talk this evening is simply to encourage all of you to follow a philosophy similar to the one I've followed, which is to say that digital humanities is all about creating fun tools and then ideally using those fun tools. And I don't know how many of you have played with ToposText. It's both an app and a website. The reason I invented it is I'm a hopeless romantic who would really like to be a 19th century English gentleman. I lack a few of the attributes for that. I lack the large independent income, and I lack the ability to ride a horse, and my Latin isn't all that great either. But I am in Greece, and I get on my bicycle and I try to find every ancient site that I possibly can. And in doing that, I wanted to be like an early British traveler who somehow had all of the ancient sources either in his memory or in his saddlebags, or probably in the saddlebags of one of his servants. So my first dream had been that I would create a nice digital library of the texts I wanted, and I would have them in an e-reader. That is to say, I'd have Pausanias and Herodotus and Thucydides, where I could carry them around as I traveled through Greece, since I didn't have a servant to carry them for me, and consult them on the spot. I don't know if you've ever tried consulting an ancient text on the spot. Usually it's raining, or the wind is blowing, or the site is so magical that you cannot possibly afford to take the time to take out a book. And I discovered with the e-reader I'd created that I wasn't using it. It was the idea that you would open up a text and find where in that text the relevant thing was. It was too difficult. So instead, I had this lovely moment. I was admiring the Pleiades project, and I suspect many of you about Pleiades. It's at the core of most ancient digital humanities right now. It is this huge database of ancient place names mapped via something called the Barrington Atlas of Greek and Roman civilization. It's a set of coordinates, relatively good, but not completely accurate coordinates for many thousands of ancient places along with the name. And because the Pleiades project started with the fundamental idea that data should be openly accessible, it created the ability to download all of these places and coordinates and other information as an enormous Excel spreadsheet. And I discovered that Excel spreadsheet and my heart soared. And at some point I realized that you could apply the concept of mashing of data. You could take my texts, and I had a lot of texts by then, all the basic ones, and mash those texts to the list of places and coordinates in Pleiades. And it turns out to be not a completely simple thing to do, but it wasn't impossibly difficult. The result was to create a library of texts that were, each place name was tagged. So Kinosarges, which is it's a gymnasium and region of Athens, every mention of that word a friend of mine wrote a script that would search for those, each example of the word and tag it, and wrote another script that would search through all of my texts and create a lovely index. And the index is what you see now. And then the idea being that wherever you were, as you were riding your bicycle, you would have in your mobile phone a map showing all of the antiquities nearby. And if you clicked on it, you would get a list of all of the ancient mentions of that place. And then you would, with keyword and context, you could see just enough information to say, oh, this looks like what I ought to read. And if you clicked on Aristophanes' Nights, you would read the passage in English. And if you clicked on the little logo for Greek, you would then read the Greek. And the idea being that on the spot, you would have access to the crucial information scholars had used over 2,000 years, and British gentlemen as well, to understand why a place was important. So anyway, that is what I did. The interesting part then became trying to make the information more usable, more accessible. At any rate, I gradually over time assembled a library of, it's now 800 texts more or less, 700 and something, pretty much everything that talks about ancient places in a meaningful way. And if you choose a random text, Lucian Alexander, the false prophet, if your internet works, you will get, the full text of that with a certain amount of metadata available to help you with it. I've gradually tried to make all of my texts findable to, on the internet, giving them their canonical text service ID, which is an ID created by the Perseus catalog of ancient texts, and also a Wikidata ID. Every work in classical antiquity now has a Wikidata ID, and Wikidata gives you access to a tiny bit of information about a thing, and it will usually be a nice pivot to other identification, and sometimes to a Wikipedia article, in this case only in Italian. But I wanted to make my texts part of an environment of easily findable, shareable texts. And then for every text that you're reading, if you see Mysia, it will tell you where Mysia is, which is, actually there's several Mysias, but this is the one in Turkey. And then you can go very quickly through that. The places have grown to be 7,000 odd, because over time I have gotten tired of literary references and have started adding very obscure archaeological sites wherever I find them, and also correcting the coordinates of ancient sites where possible, so that if you get on your bicycle, you can travel to them and actually find them. That turns out to be a non-trivial task for us. There's a section for people as well, but it's a rather crude one, because it turns out there are thousands of people with the same name, and it's impossible for one person like me to disambiguate them, at least by hand. It can be done, I think, programmatically over time, and that's one of my goals for it. But you'll have a tyrant of Sicyon mentioned in Plutarch and Pausanias, and you can thus, at a glance, find most of the important things about him. The thing I'm proudest of, though, in ToposText is that at a certain point I realized that with 20 million words of text, you have a huge reservoir of information. And the whole point of having information is when you can look at it as a unit and search it as a unit. And so I created a very simple regular expression search, which we included in ToposText, which allows you to search for two terms that you find. For example, a subject I'm very interested in is ancient Greek temples and what their relation is to, why they get built. And so one theory I had is that temples are very often built as a result of a vow that someone makes in a moment of extremity, usually just before fighting a battle. That is, most Roman generals, before they engage in battle with a fearsome energy, they will raise their hands and pray to the gods. If you give me victory, local gods, I will build you a beautiful temple and celebrate games in your honor. And so just to look for examples of that, look for temple, and then here the /b is the regular expression saying the beginning of the word. And you probably don't want to find vowel either, but you might want to find vowed, so we'll leave it that way. Within 200 characters, and hit a search. And it takes quite a while because I'm not a very good programmer, but eventually it will pop up with useful, perhaps, information. Yes, 119 instances found for temple within 200 characters of vowel. And it turns out you have Homer's Iliad, and you have, many of these things are not relevant to what I'm interested in, but you might find, yes, they built temples also and consecrated altars to those gods to whom they had addressed their vows during their battles. I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing I was looking for. And instead of having to read through horribly boring secondary sources, you can find the primary sources on your screen in a few seconds. And that, for me, is a really neat tool that anybody should be able to use, including people who have not yet memorized the classical canon of Greek and Latin. And so for me, it's a very democratic system. And also in the democratic vein, I decided that all of the work I've done especially with places, I've gone through with Google Earth and geolocated, thousands of places. You can download that to your computer and have it. More importantly, if you're a scholar, you can download a serialized version of the data that can be slurped up into a formal gazetteer and used, for example, in Recogito. I have other hopes for the future for it, but this is a start. Another crucial element is for the website it is now structured so there is an API, and anyone can write a URL query which will ask ToposText to send them a specific paragraph or a specific text. it will come in the form of rather ugly JSON, but if you know what you're doing, which unfortunately I don't, you can then turn that into a beautiful box in your own computer. I'd advertise that because it's still a work in progress, but it's trying to make all of the resources as available and useful to people as I can. Anyway, that's the philosophy behind ToposText, simply to be useful. And that, I guess, gets me back to the title of my talk, which is let's see, what is it? It's a sort of a bad pun, De-Ontologizing as a strategic choice in digital humanities. ToposText would never have happened if I had known what I was doing when I started. I knew nothing about digital humanities. I knew nothing about metadata. I knew nothing about intellectual property rights. I knew nothing about programming. I had the ability to do an Excel spreadsheet, and I could do basic text editing. And that gave me the courage to plunge ahead and create this. I've since then gone to many conferences, attended many lectures, watched many people, been part of some projects and advised other projects. And what I have seen in this process is that we are trying very hard in digital humanities to achieve ontological rigor. We are trying to make every word we use, every entity we create, something that a completely humorless computer can understand and deal with in a rational manner. It turns out that computers are not that interested in dealing with our entities in a rational manner. They will do whatever you tell them to do. But meanwhile, in the process of trying to develop a philosophically, epistemologically, ontologically consistent system, we have tied ourselves in knots. And I'll use ToposText as an example. ToposText is mostly, a huge list of place names in texts. The problem is, I know what a place name is. What is a place? When you start to think about it, when I have the word Athens, is it simply a place name? Is it the ancient polity of Athens, which occupied various amounts of territory at various times in a fluctuating manner? Is it a modern idea of Athens used for political purposes through the centuries? What is it? Once you get deeply into that question, you paralyze yourself. I took a very sort of stupid approach. Athens is Athens. Athens is a point on the map. And every time you see the word Athens, you link it to a point on the map. And that's it. And for my purposes, that was good enough. I did not have to look at the question of, am I talking about Athens as a political entity, a geographic entity, a philosophical entity? I did not try to tell either my users or my computer what to think about that. It saved me a lot of time. When I was creating categories of places to allow some basic filtering to take place, and I guess I could show you how that works. Let's see, for example, for places, let's see, you can always, actually, how can you always? Well, anyway, there used to be a lovely filter. Where it is now, I'm not seeing it. I may have disinvented it. Well, that's good. But for people, for example, you can. Well, I know where the filter is on my app, but you can filter them in various ways by gender and type, by century, by period, which is different from century. So you can look only for mythical people, or only for, unfortunately, I cannot see the controls of the, yes, for animals, mythical animals. And it turns out we have one mythical animal, the Erymanthian, actually two, the Caledonian boar and the Erymanthian boar. But to do that, you have to make choices that are sometimes very difficult. And if you make those choices in a totally rigorous manner, you'll never get them done. So anyway, when I say de-ontologizing, what I mean is be practical. Don't worry about how your concepts are going to be used, because you cannot actually predict that. Instead, make them as flexible as you can and allow people to export them in as many ways as possible. And most of the work I do, I know that GIS systems, ArcGIS or even QGIS, are fantastic, but they're too complicated for me. I discovered that Google Earth will do everything I really need and do it simply and intuitively. So just to be annoying, I'll show you something I worked on once. There's a lovely database in the American School of Classical Studies of all of the finds from the Agora excavations over the decades. That data is publicly exposed, it's freely accessible. So I went and found all of the find spots of all of the inscriptions in the database. And I said, well, I will map them all and I will link them where possible to the original publication, both to the Agora card number, to the Hesperia entry, and where possible to the text in the Packard Humanities website. And it's probably completely useless, but for me, it was a wonderful experience in combining data in ways that made it accessible in a different manner than anyone had before. And anyway, that's what you're all supposed to be doing. Let me go back now to the PowerPoint, just to say that a lot of what I do and a lot of what I think you should be doing is transforming old texts, printed texts normally, into data that is accessible, shareable, processable. And the basic tools for that, in my case, are very simple ones. Here's an example of it's a scholarly publication. It's Paysage of Landscapes of Achaia, where it has a catalog of ancient places, ancient sites with pottery, with inscriptions, with buildings. And someone put it out there as a PDF, and it turns out that if you hit Control A, you will select all of it, and if you hit Control C, you will copy all of it, and if you hit Paste, you can paste the whole text into a text editor. And the text editor I use is Notepad++, which is a very good, powerful, easy to use, and free text editor. And then you learn the lovely art of regular expressions, the ability to, it's wildcards in Microsoft Word. I hope you all have had a course in regular expressions, because it gives you the ability to look for any pattern of letters and numbers and symbols and replace it in a systematic way throughout a large text. And so, for example, with this, this very large book, I was able to turn it into an Excel spreadsheet. And that Excel spreadsheet then becomes part of a broader database of ancient sites in Achaia in Greece, which will soon, I hope, be quite useful to people. Anyway, that's one of the things that I'm working on, and all of you should be aware that with a good text editor like Notepad++, and the ability to use Excel filters and VLOOKUP, you can do most of the work of a complicated database without having to learn any significant programming. Anyway, that's the moral there. Okay, one last thing that I will present it to you simply because I like it. This is a screen of let's see if I can get this. All right. This is all the ToposText places that I've, most of them borrowed from Pleiades. Some of them I've mapped myself. But when you have so many places in a single database, you can then play with them. And one of my theories, it was a nice theory, is that when people are praying to their gods, they will tend to face in some direction associated with their god. And for example, in early Judaism, there was a tendency to face toward Jerusalem. In Islam, there is still a very strong habit of facing toward Mecca when you pray. You see faint traces of that in ancient Greece. And I wondered whether in Greece, as in Islam, architecture would somehow signal the way that you prayed. And that got me looking at how temples are oriented. And temple orientation is one of these huge, fun issues that many people have argued about, not very usefully. But I ended up just using Google Earth to draw lines through temples and see where they pointed. And oddly enough, when you do that, you discover that there are a number of temples of Apollo that point very nicely to the island of Delos. And Delos is an important place to point if you're an Apollo temple, because it's the birthplace of Apollo. So totally logical. And some of these temples are oriented very accurately, some less accurately. They're, the technology was limited, but it seemed like a promising theory, and I went looking for other things. And my favorite example still is in ancient Olympia, where if you have mapped the Hera temple at Olympia and can find it in Google Earth, then you can draw a line through it. And if you draw a line through it, you will discover that it points toward the one sanctuary of Hera that is more important than anywhere else in the world, which is the sanctuary of the Argive Heraion in the territory of Argos. And it's 60 odd kilometers away. But I mean, it's so accurate that it's hard to say it's a coincidence. And it may be a coincidence. I'm having fun writing it up, but it's something that is doable when you have lots of information that is collected and organized in a way like this. And all right, so this is what ToposText has done for me. I can talk about it at great length, but at this point, I think I'd rather go back to your questions if you have any after this.